The tail shook like a hand struck by a blunt fist. Thin metal screamed. Alarms clawed through the cramped tube of the fuselage like rats. Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Reed felt his molars jar in their sockets when the B-17 lurched. The world outside telescoped into a single black slit, and a smell of ozone and hot oil filled the tiny turret behind the stabilizer. "Bandit! 2 o'clock low!" someone shouted over the rattle of engines and the whistles of flak bursting like angry flowers. The voice was frantic, but steady, the kind you hear from men who have rehearsed terror until it becomes muscle memory. Tommy had the tail gun hot. His gloves shook, but his hands were locked, practiced. He watched the strip of sky in his rear view and saw the Messerschmitt come like a shark sliding into the wake of a ship. It was low, oblique, hugging the blind sector between the vertical stabilizer and the fuselage where, on every training mannequin and every printed manual, the human neck and the geometry of the B-17 had made safe death for crews time and again. He adjusted the little mirror that sat crooked on its mount behind his right shoulder, a sliver of polished glass set at such an angle it showed the flank that the naked eye could not see until the last instant. In that brief, reflected flash, he watched the German close his throttle and feather the approach like a man who'd rehearsed the move 1,000 times. The Messerschmitt's pilot had the confidence of surprise. He'd been making a career of exploiting geometry. Tommy flicked his wrist 3 degrees to the left, and the mount clicked in that cheap, blessed locking notch he'd made himself. The mirror gave him an extra 2 heartbeats of lead time. 2 beats that meant everything. 2 beats were the time to breathe out and line the Browning machine gun just ahead of the fighter's nose, to compensate for lead and speed and the sweet and bitter arithmetic of distance and time, and how bullets and aircraft meet over black fields. He squeezed off a short, disciplined burst. The tracers stitched the Messerschmitt's belly. For a moment, a perfect, terrible arc of metal and fire hung in the sky, and Tommy felt the rest of the plane inhale with him. The enemy shuddered. The Messerschmitt fishtailed in a half-rolling descent. He heard a sick little bang and a sheened strip of fuselage peel off the German craft as it went out of control. The bomber shuddered as it recovered. The radio barked congratulations and curses, and the kind of profanity that bond crews in a single metallic hymn. The waist gunners breathed. The waist gunners who'd been silent 2 seconds before were alive to the miracle that had just happened. 8 of 10 on that mission would speak about it later. 2 would not. Later, when the debrief forms were filled and the men were back in the mess tent trying not to drink for too long, the story would be told with wide hands and a laugh that lived on the brink of clinic hysteria. Tommy Reed and his damn barber's mirror saved our skins. None of it would capture the way the metal tasted in Tommy's mouth when he had watched his reflection and the enemy both turn gray in the same heartbeat. It was a small object with a crooked screw, a scrap of ingenuity sworn to the cold physics of angles. No general would rally a parade because of a sliver of glass. No official memo would be printed overnight with a gold seal. But there, in the tiny sliver of reflected sky, something had changed. The tail gun was no longer a blind island. The gunner was not just a suitor of luck. He was a marksman with a new kind of sight. A month later, that mirror would be tested. 3 months after that, colonels would be staring at statistics that refused to be ignored. But for now, the engines of the 305th roared, and the men wrote things in their logbooks in tiny, hurried script. 1 Messerschmitt knocked off. Probable kill. Tail gunner. Reed. Crew. Alive. And the mirror sat, crooked and ordinary, in the tail, catching a sliver of light like a promise. Tommy Reed did not begin with aircraft or doctrine. He began with barns and broken glass. Born in 1915 in Akron, Ohio, His childhood had been the kind where boys learned how to aim at tins and how wind could make or break a shot. He'd been the son of a machinist and a seamstress, spending Saturdays in the police range because his cousin worked a precinct, and because the old men taught him to breathe like a metronome and to let the shot come where it wanted. By the time he was 23, he was the most reliable bench rest on his squad's team. A cop's marksman who could hit a coin at 50 yards with the kind of patience that looked suspicious to the untrained eye. When war came and America's whisper became a shout, Tommy volunteered. He was not the sort to be commandeered by farmers or lawyers, not the type to sit out. He had watched his brother go away and had the kind of conviction that didn't need parades to be validated. The Air Corps took him on as a gunner, and the man who stood in the vacuum of the tail had the same habits he'd learned on the range. He cataloged small advantages and turned them into outcomes. The B-17's tail posed problems known before he was born. The aircraft's shape created blind cones. The tail gunner sat in a cramped cage of plexiglass with limited swivel and an even smaller window into the world. Doctrines taught layered defense, overlapping fields of fire from waist, top, chin, and tail turrets, but the geometry still allowed human predators to exploit angles for a few precious seconds. It was in those seconds that entire crews could be killed. Tommy noticed patterns. Fighters did not make grand frontal assaults when an escort screened them. They slipped in low or high from the oblique aft, hugging an angle that allowed them to pass out of the tail gun's aperture until the last instant. Observers with binoculars and instructors with diagrams approved tactics, but no training system had yet altered what the B-17's steel and movement permitted. So Tommy started to tinker. In between missions, he read diagrams, scavenged scrap mirrors from wrecked vehicles, begged a machinist to bend a bracket, and in the engine smoke afternoons, he talked to other gunners the way men trade recipes, with a ruthless eye for what worked. He learned which models of mirror reflected less glare, how a small hood could cut sunspots, how a thin parabolic face could widen angle without fragmenting the image. The device he built was not a magic wand, it was a clever, precisely placed betrayal of the tail's geometry. It turned a missing viewpoint into a borrowed one. When he first propped that polished sliver behind his shoulder, it was because he had to. He could not rotate his body enough to see around the thick vertical stabilizer. The mirror acted as an optical reprojection, giving his brain the missing data that his neck could not supply. On the range and in dogfights, that extra second or two to recognize a target transforms into the distance a bullet travels. Accumulate seconds, and you accumulate lives. There is always resistance to the improvised. The Air Corps had manuals and auditors and a culture that placed survival in rules rather than in ad hoc solutions. Field modification was not only frowned upon, it was often punished. Unauthorized changes to weapons risked catastrophe. Tommy knew this. He also knew there existed a gulf between manuals and actual combat, and men in foxholes sometimes write their own appendices. His first production mirror was crude, a curved piece of porthole glass, a battered hood, a jammed swivel. He fixed it with baling wire. He did not go to the armorer because he knew the armorer would file a complaint. He did not tell his crew for 2 days, for superstition's sake and for measurement. He wanted to be sure that what he felt in the moment would endure in statistics. The first time he used it in anger, when the Messerschmitt came low and precise like a scalpel, he didn't think about doctrine. His training scrapped to the surface like steel. His trigger discipline made the difference. But he also knew, in the delicate arithmetic way of craftsmen, that 2 seconds were the product of physics and practice, and that if the mirror could deliver those seconds regularly, he could begin to beat the geometry itself. After that flight, 3 other tail gunners soon asked, "Where did you get that mirror?" Tommy shrugged and mumbled something about scrounge. On the second mission, he let Corporal Alvarez test it. Alvarez did not swear at first. His hands simply stopped trembling during the pass. The mirror did not turn the B-17 into an invincible fortress. It did something better. It changed the odds. What followed was the pattern everyone who's ever invented something new knows. Small successes, whispered replications, informal tests, and the risk that someone in blue would order the device destroyed because it was unauthorized. Tommy feared reprisal, but like any man who'd learned from range days, he measured the return. The mirror cost nothing the army could not replace. The potential for saved lives was enormous. In the tale, in the hours before dawn, men like to tell stories about lineage and craft. Tommy's story was that of a marksman who refused to accept the limits of a platform. He promised himself that he would test the thing properly, gather proof, and then make the hard ask, show the brass a piece of paper that convinced them geometry could be beaten by observation. September 1943. RAF Ridgewell, Essex, England. The morning fog clings to the airfield like unwashed wool. The metallic silhouettes of B-17s glimmer faintly through the haze. Bomb bay doors open like yawns after sleepless nights. Ground crews move like ants, refueling, loading belts of 50 caliber rounds, wiping oil from engine nacelles already streaked with black carbon. Inside one of the maintenance hangars, under a naked bulb that swings with each rumble of a passing truck, Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Reed kneels beside the tail of a battered B-17F, nicknamed Stella Maris. He's hunched over a steel bracket polishing the edge of a new edition, a convex mirror no bigger than a man's hand, fixed to the right inner rib of the tail turret. The surface gleams faintly, curved to catch the blind zone just beyond the vertical stabilizer. "Reed, you planning to shave back there?" Corporal Mike Alvarez, his crew's mechanic, teases from behind a toolbox. Tommy doesn't look up. "Nah, just want to see what's sneaking up before it bites." Alvarez snorts, wiping his hands. "Command's gonna hang you for field modding government property again." "Only if they notice," Tommy replies, tightening the bracket with deliberate calm. "And if they do, maybe they'll finally admit these birds can't see their own backs." He steps back, checking the angle. Through the plexiglass bubble, the reflection shows the opposite stabilizer and the space beyond it. The exact pocket from which German fighters love to appear. For weeks he's been refining this. The first mirror, a cracked car side glass from a wrecked Jeep, gave him an idea. Now, with Alvarez's help, it's become a proper optical system. Adjustable mount, anti-glare hood fashioned from a cut oxygen mask, a spring lock that lets the gunner tilt for altitude differences. But it's still unauthorized, and unauthorized ideas in the 8th Air Force are ammunition for court-martial. 1. The proposal no one wanted. When Stella Maris returned from her last run over Bremen, the debriefing room stank of burnt cordite and adrenaline. Reed waited until the crew logged their kills before approaching Captain Henry Royce, the squadron operations officer. Royce was a good pilot, steady, by the book, but open enough to listen to his men before chewing them out. "Sir," Reed began, sliding his notebook forward, "I've been tracking approach times of enemy fighters. Thought you'd want to see." Royce frowned, flipping through pages of tight handwriting and simple diagrams. Arcs of approach, seconds between first visual contact and engagement, hit percentages compared to baseline stats from training manuals. Reed had even penciled a small chart comparing 3 flights with his mirror to 6 flights without. Royce raised an eyebrow. "What's this? A mirror?" "Yes, sir. A simple convex mirror mounted inside the tail. Extends visual range by about 15 degrees either side of the stabilizer." I know what 15 degrees is, Sergeant," Royce interrupted, though not unkindly. "But where exactly are you getting these numbers?" "From real missions, sir. Cross-checked with waist gunners spotting calls and stopwatch timings. We've got earlier detection by an average of 6 seconds. That's almost 1,000 feet of approach distance at combat speeds. Royce exhaled, running a hand through his thinning hair. You're telling me a shaving mirror improved tail gun accuracy? Not just accuracy, sir. Survivability. There was silence then, the kind of pause filled with both curiosity and danger. Innovations were currency, but unapproved innovations were contraband. Finally, Royce set the notebook down. All right, Reed, I'll bite. But you keep this quiet. No brass. Not until we've seen more proof. 2. Unofficial trials. Proof came faster than expected. On September 12th, Stella Maris flew her 17th mission. Target: a rail junction outside Hanover. Clear skies meant easy bombing, but worse news for gunners. The Luftwaffe hunted in daylight like hawks in open fields. Reed manned his turret, mirror angled perfectly. At 19,000 feet, the first call came. Bandits, 7 o'clock low! The waist gunners strained, but Reed already had visual, 2 twin-engine BF-110s climbing to intercept. Through his mirror, their silhouettes were small but sharp against the horizon. He called the warning 6 seconds before radar picked them up. When they broke into attack position, he was already tracking. His first burst of fire traced a red-hot curve across the sky. One 110 peeled away trailing smoke. The other aborted its pass entirely. The after-action report recorded it simply. Tail gunner engaged enemy earlier than expected. Enemy attack disrupted before firing range. No damage sustained. Reed didn't write his name on the report, but Alvarez grinned when they landed. That mirror of yours just scared a German pilot out of his breakfast. 3. Numbers don't lie, but commanders do. Within 2 weeks, 4 other tail gunners had copied Reed's setup using Jeep mirrors and scrap metal. They called it the Ghost Eye. Unofficially, loss rates in their group dipped, slightly, but noticeably. Fewer enemy fighters were making successful approach vectors from the rear low angles. Then came trouble. Lieutenant Arthur Bensley, the group armament officer, caught a glimpse of the modifications during a hangar inspection. He froze, jaw tightening as if he'd swallowed a coin. "What in God's name is that?" he barked, pointing to the curved mirror glinting under sunlight. Reed straightened. "Field vision aid, sir, for blind spot coverage. Unauthorized equipment. Remove it. With respect, sir, it's improving accuracy." "Sergeant, you don't improve Air Force doctrine with vanity mirrors. Do you want glare blinding your gunners? You want reflections giving our position away?" Reed kept his voice calm. "Sir, the mirror's hooded. No glare. And it's internal." But Bensley wasn't listening. "Orders are orders. Remove all unapproved fittings by 0600. Next inspection, I see that thing again. I'm writing you up for insubordination." He stormed off, leaving a trail of echoing boots. Alvarez spat on the ground. "Every war's got 2 fronts, the one with bullets and the one with paperwork." Reed said nothing. That night, under the hum of distant generators, he removed the mirror, logged his notes, and waited. The next mission, 3 planes from their squadron went down to rear-angle attacks. 12 men didn't come back. 4. The turning point. The incident turned quiet doubt into anger. During debrief, surviving crews cursed doctrine louder than the Germans. Reed kept his silence until Captain Royce called him in privately. The older man looked hollow, eyes red-rimmed from reading casualty reports. "I read the debriefs," Royce said. "Those boys were hit from behind again. You warned me." "Sir, save it. I want the mirror back on Stella Maris tomorrow. Officially, I never said that." Word spread fast. By late September, a handful of planes in the 305th and 379th bomb groups were secretly equipped. Reed and Alvarez became makeshift instructors, showing other gunners how to angle the mount to match their turret geometry. To avoid glare complaints, Alvarez painted the mirror edges matte black and fitted rubber hoods scavenged from oxygen masks. The result looked more professional, almost factory-made. When one of the higher officers, Lieutenant Colonel George Perrin, visited the base for inspection, he actually mistook the mirrors for a new standardized part and nodded approval before anyone corrected him. By then, the field data spoke louder than memos. A month of missions produced the following internal summary, scribbled in Royce's handwriting. Tail gun engagement rate increased by 47%. Confirmed enemy kills, 8. AVG 2.6x improvement. No recorded glare incidents. Not bad for a barber mirror, Alvarez quipped. 5. The skeptics and the test board. But bureaucracy never sleeps. The Air Force Testing Board at Bovingdon caught wind of the mirror contraption through rumor and filed a notice. Unauthorized optical modification reported in 305th Group. Potential safety hazard. Submit design for evaluation. For most men, that would have been a death sentence for innovation. But fortune favors stubborn engineers, and Reed was nothing if not stubborn. He was summoned to the testing board on October 3rd. The conference room was sterile. 3 officers, 1 stenographer, a table stacked with manuals. Colonel Matthew Calhoun, head of armament trials, tapped the mirror with a pencil. Sergeant Reed, explain this device. Reed stood at attention. Sir, it's a simple convex mirror mounted to the inner rib of the tail turret. It compensates for the blind zone created by the stabilizer. Average detection improvement, 6 to 8 seconds based on field data. Calhoun frowned. How many tests? 17 missions, sir. You understand unauthorized modifications can result in disciplinary action? Yes, sir. But respectfully, no doctrine accounts for the tail's geometry under combat stress. The mirror gives early warning, no failures recorded. The colonel leaned back. You're claiming a 6-second improvement? That's the difference between life and death in a dogfight. Yes, sir. Another officer, Major Davidson, operations analyst, flipped through the notes. We'll verify this, Sergeant. You'll install it under supervision on 3 aircraft for controlled evaluation. Consider this your one chance. Reed saluted. Understood, sir. As he left, he caught the colonel's murmur. If this works, we'll be hearing about mirrors for the next 50 years. 6. Trial under fire. The official trial began October 10th. 3 bombers, Stella Maris, Iron Betty, and Lucky 7, were fitted with standardized versions of Reed's mirror, built by the base machine shop. The rules were strict. No other field mods allowed. All gunners briefed identically. Engagement times logged independently by observers. The missions were dangerous. Deep strikes into Germany, long routes where interception was guaranteed. On the second day, near Kassel, the test paid off in blood and proof. At 22,000 feet, Iron Betty took point in a formation of 27 B-17s. The Luftwaffe launched a coordinated rear attack. 6 FW-190s diving in staggered formation. Tail gunner Willie Haynes, using Reed's mirror system, caught the first 2 fighters seconds before their approach line. His call, 6 o'clock low, closing, went out over intercom. The rest of the formation swung defensive fire in time. Observers later estimated the warning came 9 seconds earlier than standard reaction time. In that window, the formation shifted altitude slightly, and the attack broke apart. 2 German fighters were shot down. No bombers lost. The after-action report was signed by Major Davidson himself. Mirror sight contributed to early detection and coordinated response. No glare or mechanical interference reported. Recommend continuation of test. Calhoun sent a cable the next morning. Authorize expansion to 12 aircraft. For Reed, the vindication felt almost unreal. He didn't celebrate, just sat quietly on a fuel drum cleaning his gun. Alvarez slapped his shoulder. "You realize what just happened? They're stealing your crazy idea." "Good," Reed said, lighting a cigarette. "Means it worked." 7. The data doesn't blink. By November, the tests became full-scale adoption in 2 entire groups. Preliminary results stunned even skeptics. Metric Standard Tail Gun Mirror System, improvement, AVG. Detection time, 14.2. SEC, 21.1. SEC, plus 48%. Hit probability, 1.0. Baseline, 2.9x, plus 190%. Rear angle loss rate, 12%, 5%, 58%. The Air Force's internal memo phrased it dryly. Experimental optical field aid demonstrates statistically significant improvement in rear defensive performance. Unofficially, crews began painting tiny mirrors on their plane nose art. The look back, silver eye, angel's rear view. The superstition spread. If your bird had a mirror, you came home. 8. We're not supposed to survive this long. In December, after a brutal raid on Schweinfurt, the Stella Maris limped home with 1 engine dead and half her elevator shredded. But she made it. At debrief, Royce looked around the room at his surviving men. "You know," he said quietly, "we're not supposed to survive this long." Reed just nodded. "Maybe we started seeing death a few seconds sooner." The colonel at headquarters sent an official commendation. It didn't mention Reed by name, only innovative field optical adjustment developed within 305th Bomb Group. That was enough. 9. Legacy in progress. By spring 1944, the mirror was standardized across most 8th Air Force bomber units as the Rear Observation Auxiliary Sight, Model 1. Manufactured versions replaced field improvisations, with anti-glare coatings and adjustable mounts. The results rippled through the air war. German attack patterns shifted. Pilots began avoiding low rear approaches entirely, favoring head-on assaults instead. Reed never gave another interview, never wrote a report beyond his field notes. His mirror became a line item in a technical manual, nothing more than a diagram and 2 sentences. But to the men who'd flown behind that thin piece of curved glass, it was salvation. Alvarez said it best during their last mission briefing. "Funny how the thing that saves you isn't always a gun or armor. Sometimes it's just the right angle." Reed smiled, packed his flight gloves, and walked out into the cold dawn. The same dawn that had watched him, months earlier, polishing a mirror under a swaying bulb, wondering if anyone would ever believe what a piece of glass could do. RAF Ridgewell, England. The winter wind cut like ground glass. The hard stands were streaked with frost, oil puddles frozen into mirrors under the tails of motionless fortresses. Crews moved slower now, fatigued, gaunt from endless missions over a Europe that refused to surrender. Inside the operations hut, a pot-bellied stove glowed cherry red. Around it sat Captain Henry Royce, Lieutenant Arthur Bensley, the armament officer who'd once threatened Reed, and the man of the hour himself, Technical Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Reed, inventor of the mirror sight. The room smelled of coffee and damp wool. On the table lay a metal bracket and a memo stamped Headquarters 8th Air Force Test Board, Provisional. 1. The summons. Royce spoke first, voice low but urgent. "They're calling it the Auxiliary Observation Device. Calhoun's board wants a full demonstration at Bovingdon next week." Reed looked from the memo to Royce's tired eyes. "Sir? You mean officially?" "Officially," Royce confirmed. "Congratulations, Sergeant. Your toy's made enough noise that even the generals want to see it." Bensley crossed his arms. "Or to bury it," he muttered. You don't drag a mechanic halfway across the country in winter unless someone wants their name clear of blame. Royce ignored him. They're sending a staff photographer and an engineering officer. You'll mount one on the test plane yourself, explain the geometry, and fly a demonstration run under observation. Understand this, Reed. If the damn thing fails, you'll never touch another B-17 again. Reed nodded slowly. And if it works? Royce managed a thin smile. Then doctrine changes. And that scares more men than failure ever could. 2. Bureaucratic resistance. The next morning, Reed found himself in the base workshop, the cold biting through his gloves. Around him, mechanics muttered about the mirror thing, like it was a superstition. One man swore he'd seen sunlight flash off it during a climb and blamed it for drawing tracers. Another said his pilot called it a lucky charm. Reed just worked. He recut the mount from aircraft-grade aluminum, polished the convex surface, and scrawled serial number Nashager RB04 prototype on its edge, an attempt to look official for the inspectors. That evening, a messenger from Group HQ arrived. Sergeant Reed to report to Major Donald Calhoun, Armament Trials Section, RAF Bovingdon, 0700 hours, 15 December. Royce handed Reed the paper. You'll have escort clearance. Take Alvarez with you as mechanic. Sir, Alvarez grinned. You think they'll let us keep the mirror if it passes? Royce sighed. If it passes, they'll stamp a patent number on it and pretend it was their idea. 3. The board. Bovingdon's test hangar was cathedral large, echoing with typewriters and clipped voices. The test officers looked every bit the bureaucrats Reed had imagined. Crisp uniforms, polished boots, expressions of professional skepticism. Major Donald Calhoun sat at the head of the long table, pipe in hand. Beside him, Colonel Everett Lang, an engineer from right field, leafed through technical drawings. A stenographer tapped steadily in the corner. Calhoun gestured to the chair opposite him. Sergeant Reed, at ease. We've read your reports. Reed remained standing. Sir. Lang adjusted his spectacles. Before we proceed, understand that the Army Air Forces already employs certified optical devices, K3 gun sights, Mark 14 computing sights, etc. Why do we need a mirror? Reed hesitated only a heartbeat. Because none of those help a man see what's behind metal, sir. The stabilizer blocks 15 degrees of arc on either side. That's where the Germans come from. Calhoun nodded to a chart. We've confirmed your detection time data. Impressive, if accurate. But these improvements could also be coincidence. Different missions, altitudes, cloud cover, variables. With respect, sir, Reed said evenly, the variable was the mirror. Everything else was the same. Lang leaned back, pipe smoke curling around his head. You built this with Jeep glass and baling wire? Yes, sir. And you claim it triples accuracy? No, sir. The men shooting did that. The mirror just gave them time. The colonel's eyebrows lifted slightly at the answer. Calhoun cleared his throat. We'll test it properly. 1 B-17, standardized mount, daylight run with observers. If you're right, Sergeant, the numbers will tell us. Reed saluted. Understood. 4. The test flight. 2 days later, the test plane, B-17G Lady Fortune, stood gleaming in the frost. On its tail was Reed's newest mirror, precision cut, perfectly aligned. Alvarez had spent the night calibrating the angle by lamplight, matching it to the sight line of the twin 50 cal Brownings. At 09 OT, Lady Fortune lifted off into a pale sun. Inside her cramped tail turret, Reed strapped in beside a combat camera operator assigned to record the test. The plan was simple. A pair of RAF Spitfires would simulate enemy intercepts from the blind sectors, while Reed logged detection times with and without the mirror. The first pass came from low starboard, sun at their backs, a perfect blind spot attack. Reed's eyes flicked to the mirror. He saw the glint of wingtip before any instrument warned them. "Contact, 5 o'clock low!" he barked. Stopwatches clicked in the observer's hands. Reed tracked the Spitfire across the mirror's curve, firing a short burst of blanks. When they landed an hour later, the datasheets told the story. Approach vector standard detection mirror detection. Gain 5 o'clock low, 12.4 sec, 20.7 sec, plus 8.3. 7 o'clock low, 13.1 sec, 21.0 sec, plus 7.9. 4 o'clock high, 15.8 sec, 22.3 sec, plus 6.5. Major Calhoun studied the clipboard. 7 seconds average, he murmured. That's an eternity up there. Colonel Lang smiled thinly. Looks like your barber mirror works, Sergeant. Reed exhaled for the first time that day. 5. The report that started a war of memos. Within a week, Calhoun's official report reached the desks of higher command. Subject, preliminary evaluation, auxiliary observation device, AOD. Findings, significant improvement in rear sector detection, no adverse optical effects. Recommendation, controlled field deployment to additional groups for confirmation. That should have been the end of it. But headquarters was a city of competing interests. The Armament Division feared the optics section would claim credit. The optics section feared losing funding to truck driver engineering. Suddenly, the simple mirror was a political football. A memorandum from Brigadier General Henry McClellan, Director of Materiel, arrived in January. While results are promising, widespread modification without standardized production may jeopardize flight safety. Suspend field installation pending further study. Royce read the memo aloud in the operations hut and slammed it on the table. Suspend field installation? That means rip them all out. Alvarez cursed under his breath. They're gonna kill more men with their pens than the Luftwaffe ever could. Reed stayed silent. He'd seen this before. Innovations strangled by the red tape of hierarchy. But he wasn't ready to bury it. 6. Going over heads. 2 nights later, Reed typed a letter by hand, the keys of the Underwood clattering like distant gunfire. To Lieutenant General Ira C. Eaker, Deputy Commander, 8th Air Force. Subject, Field Experience. Auxiliary Observation Device. Sir, respectfully, as a non-commissioned aircrew member with 25 combat missions, I submit direct operational evidence of the AOD's effectiveness. Current suspension order endangers crews. Request immediate reconsideration and field continuation pending factory standardization. Signed, T. Sergeant Thomas Reed, 305th Bomb Group. Royce found out the next day and nearly choked on his cigarette. You wrote to Eaker, directly? Yes, sir. You realize that's circumventing chain of command? Yes, sir. Royce stared at him, then laughed bitterly. God help me, I hope he reads it. He did. Within a week, a teletype message crackled through from 8th Air Force HQ. Subject, AOD field data verified. Continue controlled deployment. Production approval to follow. Priority, immediate. Against all odds, the mirror had survived bureaucracy. 7. Doctrine rewritten. By February 1944, the Air Force Engineering Division issued Technical Order 11A93, making the mirror sight an official component of all B-17G and B-24 rear turrets. Factories began fitting standardized anti-glare convex mirrors with adjustable mounts. The directive read, Purpose, to provide rear gunners with auxiliary field of vision, eliminating blind sector. Estimated increase in reaction time, 30 to 40%. At Ridgewell, crews cheered when the order arrived. Alvarez toasted with a tin cup of coffee. To the crazy mirror that beat the brass. Reed simply smiled, tracing the serial number on his first prototype. It was scratched, dented, but still whole. 8. The Generals and the Ghost. But every victory has a price. Weeks later, Reed was summoned again, this time to the London headquarters of the U.S. Army Air Forces in Europe. He arrived expecting commendation. Instead, he found a meeting room filled with officers he had never met. Engineers, tacticians, and public relations men. At the head of the table sat General Carl Spaatz himself. The general extended a hand. "Sergeant Reed, fine work. Your idea is saving aircraft every week." "Thank you, sir," Reed replied carefully. Spaatz smiled. "Which is precisely why we're redesignating it under the Armament Engineering section. You'll be transferred stateside to assist the Design Bureau, under their supervision." Reed blinked. "Sir, I belong with my crew." "Not anymore," Spaatz said gently. "Your invention's worth more than your trigger finger. We need your notes in Dayton. After that, the factories will take over." It was an honor and a sentence. Royce protested to HQ, citing Reed's combat experience, but orders were orders. Within a week, Reed and Alvarez were reassigned to Wright Field, Ohio, to oversee standardized production. Before leaving, Reed stood one last time beside Stella Maris. Her fuselage bore 23 bomb symbols now, her mirror gleaming faintly in the morning sun. Alvarez patted the metal. "Think they'll remember who built it?" Reed shrugged. "Doesn't matter who remembers, just who survives." 9. Back in America. At Wright Field, the war felt distant. No flak, no sirens, just the hum of machines and the smell of new paint. Engineers in white coats dissected Reed's design, measured curvature, drew blueprints. They spoke in formulas, not stories. To them, he was a curiosity, a field sergeant who'd stumbled onto optics. One young lieutenant asked if he'd studied physics. Reed laughed softly. "No, son. I studied not dying." When the final production model rolled off the line, Observation Mirror Assembly M9, Reed signed the inspection slip. Initialing quietly beneath the column marked Originator's Approval. It was the first and only time his name appeared on an official document. 10. The Battle of Doctrine. Even as factories installed the M9, doctrinal manuals struggled to catch up. Some old guard officers resisted, arguing that reliance on auxiliary optics could encourage complacency. Others saw it as the natural evolution of air defense. At the Air Gunnery School in Laredo, instructors began incorporating mirror-based situational awareness drills. Statistics showed tail gun hit ratios climbing. Reports flowed back across the Atlantic confirming the trend. In May 1944, the 8th Air Force's tactical bulletin stated flatly, "Average tail gunner kill rate has tripled since introduction of auxiliary observation mirror. Enemy pilots now avoid low rear approach sectors." The crazy idea had become policy. 11. Recognition deferred. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Reed watched radio coverage from an office in Ohio. Hundreds of bombers thundered toward France, each one carrying his small invention under the tail. No medals, no ceremonies, just the quiet satisfaction that thousands of men might come home because of a curved piece of glass. That autumn, a package arrived from England. A photo of Stella Maris's crew standing by their plane, mirror visible in the background. Scrawled across the bottom in grease pencil were the words, "Still looking back, still alive. Al, 305th. Reed pinned it above his bunk. 12. Epilogue of the chapter years later. Historians would argue over whether the mirror sight truly changed the air war or merely symbolized a broader shift in thinking, an embrace of field innovation over rigid doctrine. But to the men who'd sat in those tail turrets, It was gospel. The confrontation that had begun in a smoky hut in Essex had ended in the rewriting of doctrine across an entire theater of war. And somewhere in a crate at right field, the original prototype, Jeep glass, baling wire, and a scratched serial number waited silently. A reminder that sometimes the biggest battles are fought not with bullets, but with ideas that command refuses to see until they're reflected back at them. Spring 1944. England was green again. The hedgerows that had been flattened by winter convoys now stood tall, and the airfield grass shimmered like an ocean under propeller wash. The mirror sight, no longer a forbidden contraption, but a standardized instrument, gleamed beneath the tails of hundreds of flying fortresses lined in perfect formation. The 305th Bomb Group was no longer the same unit that had limped home from Bremen. The new B-17Gs bristled with upgrades, chin turrets, armor, better oxygen systems. But it was the small, curved lens under each tail gun that changed everything. No one called it the auxiliary observation device. To the men who used it, it was still Reed's mirror. The superstition had become scripture. Crews now rubbed the mirror's rim before takeoff, muttering, "See me home," as if it could ward off flak. 1. The sky over Regensburg. On the morning of April 11, 1944, the Stella Maris II, the rebuilt successor to Reed's old plane, joined a strike force of 450 bombers heading for Regensburg's aircraft factories. It would be the mirror's ultimate test. The Germans knew this raid was coming. Intercepted signals confirmed heavy fighter resistance, perhaps the last major stand of the Luftwaffe's veteran squadrons. The air would be thick with fire. In the tail of Stella Maris II, Sergeant Willie Haynes, Reed's former trainee, adjusted his oxygen mask and tapped the mirror mount lovingly. "Let's see you work your magic, Tommy," he muttered into the intercom. 30,000 feet below, the Danube snaked silver under a thin veil of clouds. German radar had them marked. At 10:27 a.m., the first call came from formation control. "Bandits! 11 o'clock high, multiple formations, closing fast." Within seconds, the calm blue sky shattered into chaos. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts dived out of the sun, cannon flashes flickering like camera bulbs. The first wave came from above, the second from the blind arcs they'd once thought safe. But this time, the tails were ready. Haynes caught a glint of sunlight in his mirror, a flash of metal under the stabilizer, and swung his guns before the warning even came. 2 FW-190s roared up, belly guns blazing, but his tracers were already in the air, slicing the space they were about to occupy. One fighter flared and broke, its wing tearing off. He shouted into the mic, 6 o'clock low, 2 more climbing." The formation shifted, overlapping fire. The Luftwaffe's practiced ambush disintegrated. Observers later clocked tailgun engagement times across the fleet averaging 7 seconds faster than before the mirror's introduction. That gap, 7 seconds, meant hundreds of tons of bombs that hit their targets instead of falling into empty fields. By mission's end, Allied losses stood at 12 bombers destroyed. Terrible, but survivable. German losses, over 60 fighters downed or crippled. In the debriefing hut that night, the air intelligence officer summed it up simply. They tried the same attack pattern they've used since '42. It doesn't work anymore. 2. You changed the math. 2 weeks later, a cable arrived at Wright Field, Ohio, where Reed was still stationed, overseeing production and training. It was from Major General Jimmy Doolittle himself. 2 T. Sergeant Thomas Reed, U.S. Beaufort. Army Air Forces. Subject, Regensburg Raid. Results. Your mirror system's operational performance exceeded expectations. Enemy attack losses up 70%, tail gun kill probability tripled. The Germans have stopped approaching from low rear sectors entirely. You changed the math. Reed read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it inside the same notebook he'd once used to track his first convoy of numbers in England. He didn't smile. He simply looked out the window at the line of newly built aircraft taxiing for test flights, each one carrying his reflection under the tail. 3. The enemy adjusts. By June, German intelligence had caught on. A captured Luftwaffe pilot, interrogated by Allied officers, described the frustration in chilling clarity. "Your bombers see us before we are ready. Their tail guns point as if guided by radar. We cannot approach unseen. We must attack from head-on, or we die." That quote was underlined 3 times in the intelligence report sent to General Spaatz. It was later circulated among tactical planners as proof that Allied adaptation had outpaced the Luftwaffe's. One British analyst summed it up succinctly. The Americans learned to fight the invisible by teaching their machines to look behind themselves. 4. The man they forgot to medal. That summer, Technical Sergeant Thomas Reed returned quietly to England, not as a gunner, but as a trainer. He traveled from base to base, instructing crews on how to calibrate and trust the mirror. He carried a battered suitcase full of prototypes and his old notes. At each stop, the airmen would line up after his lectures to shake his hand, some with tears in their eyes. One pilot from the 91st Group told him, "My tail gunner caught a Focke-Wulf yesterday before it could even aim. Saved the crew. That's your doing." Reed would nod politely and deflect the credit. "Just physics, Captain. Nothing fancy." He never asked for recognition, but recognition came. Slowly, bureaucratically. In October 1944, he received the Legion of Merit, citing innovative field adaptation contributing materially to air combat efficiency. He didn't attend the ceremony. Alvarez accepted it in his place, joking to the press, "He's probably in a hangar somewhere, polishing a mirror." 5. The Mirror War. Through late 1944 and into 1945, as Allied air superiority became absolute, the mirrors spread far beyond the 8th Air Force. The British fitted them to their Lancasters. The U.S. Navy adopted a modified version for rear gunners on PB-4Y Liberators. Even Soviet engineers copied the design for their P-2 bombers, calling it the Zadnye Zerkalo, rear glass. Each nation gave it a different name, but the principle remained the same. Defeat blindness, defeat surprise. Historians would later call this the first great information shift in air warfare. Visibility was power. The mirror, simple as it was, gave every gunner an early warning system decades before radar guidance became compact enough to fit in planes. One report from the Luftwaffe's own JG-300 squadron lamented, "The American bombers appear to have eyes behind them. It is no longer possible to close unseen." 6. Fire over Dresden. On February 13, 1945, during the firebombing of Dresden, Reed's invention faced its harshest environment yet. The bombers flew through pillars of heat and updrafts so strong they tore formation apart. Tail gunners later described the mirrors icing over, cracking, even melting from proximity to incendiary clouds, but they still worked. Crews scraped frost off with gloved hands mid-flight, desperate not to lose their rear sight lines. One after-action note from the 379th Group read, "Lost all radio, smoke everywhere, couldn't see a thing except through the mirror, caught one FW-190 creeping through cloud, shot it before it fired, survived." When Reed read that report months later, he wept for the first time since the war began. 7. The end of the war. May 8, 1945. VE Day. The war in Europe ended not with a roar, but with the hollow echo of engines shutting down for the last time. Thousands of bombers stood silent on English airfields, their props still, their mirrors dull with dust. Reed stood beside one such aircraft, a ghost of his own creation. The crews were celebrating in the mess halls, but he stayed behind, walking slowly down the line of planes. Each mirror caught fragments of light from the setting sun, reflecting distorted images of him as he passed. He touched one gently. It was warm from the day's last flight. "See me home," he whispered, the same words the gunners had used before takeoff. 8. Return to Pittsburgh. By winter, Reed was home. Pittsburgh was gray, the mills belching smoke again, the city humming with post-war rebuilding. He went back to truck driving, hauling steel, same as before the war. No one recognized him in uniform anymore. To his neighbors, he was just another veteran trying to adjust. The Bronze Star he received in the mail sat in a drawer next to a cracked mirror fragment he'd kept since England. He told his wife it was a souvenir from a plane crash. He never mentioned that it had saved more lives than he could count. Occasionally, he'd open that drawer and run a finger along the metal edge, remembering the sound of engines, the smell of oil, and the thin, clean moment between spotting death and beating it. 9. The Forgotten Notebook. In 1951, the U.S. Air Force officially declassified the development records of the Mirror site. Reed's name appeared in the appendix, misspelled as R. Reed. By then, he'd already donated his original notebook and prototype to the U.S. Army Air Force's museum at Wright-Patterson. The curator, a young lieutenant who'd never seen combat, asked him, "Did this really make that much difference?" Reed smiled faintly. "You ever driven a car with no rear-view mirror?" The lieutenant nodded. "That's what flying without it used to be like." 10. Legacy of Reflection. Decades later, the principle born in Reed's makeshift hangar lived on in every aircraft that flew. The idea of eliminating blind spots became foundational in aviation safety and even ground vehicles. Convex mirrors became standard on tanks, ships, trucks. The logic was simple. If you can see it before it sees you, you live longer. In the 1960s, NASA engineers cited the Mirror site as an early example of distributed awareness systems in their studies on spacecraft visualization. By then, Reed was retired, tending a small workshop behind his house, repairing truck mirrors for local drivers. They'd come in for replacements, not knowing the quiet old man shaping the glass had once shaped history. 11. The Museum Glass. In 1981, the U.S. Air Force Museum opened a new exhibit titled Eyes in the Sky, Innovations of the Air War. At the center stood a restored B-17 tail section. Mounted inside, behind protective plexiglass, was the original hand-cut mirror labeled Auxiliary Observation Device. Prototype 1943. Developed by T. Sergeant Thomas Reed, 305th Bomb Group. Credited with reducing rear sector losses by over 60%. Visitors passed by without much notice. Children pressed faces to the glass. Veterans stood silently. One old man, gray-haired, in a simple coat, lingered longer than most. He leaned close enough to see his own reflection. For a moment, he was back in the cold sky over Hanover, hands trembling on the grips, heart beating in sync with the guns. Then he straightened, saluted the exhibit, and left. No one recognized him. They didn't need to. 12. Epilogue. The Reflection That Stayed. When Thomas Reed died in 1983, his obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned only, "Veteran of the U.S. Army Air Forces, recipient of the Legion of Merit, survived by wife Margaret and 2 sons." It didn't say that he'd changed the way men survived war. It didn't mention the mirror or the thousands of airmen who lived because of it. But the legacy endured, quietly, faithfully. like reflection itself. Every modern aircraft, from cargo planes to fighters, still carries rear and side observation systems built on the same geometric principle Reed discovered. Engineers call it situational awareness. Pilots call it 360-degree vision. But the old gunners had another name for it, the Reed eye. And somewhere, in the hum of engines and the shimmer of glass under sunlight, that mirror still watches the skies, catching the invisible, guarding the blind spot, and reflecting one man's defiance against death.